The limousine's back window was tinted so dark you could barely make out the outline of the woman inside. But the flash of cameras found her anyway. The quick flares lit her face in brief glimpses, red-rimmed eyes, lips pressed together in an effort not to tremble, and hands clutching a single tissue that looked like it had soaked through hours earlier. Meghan Markle wasn't just walking away from another high society event. This time, she was leaving something far bigger, the collapse of her $100 million dream. And at the heart of that collapse stood a man once seen as a friend and business partner, Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos. How did it come to this? Just a few years ago, Meghan and Harry were the golden couple of the streaming world. Their names alone could cause stock prices to spike, send tabloids into a frenzy, and fuel endless social media debate. When they stepped away from royal duties in 2020, they didn't just walk away from Buckingham Palace. They ran straight into the arms of Silicon Valley and Hollywood, and none welcomed them more warmly than Netflix. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But now, after months of behind-the-scenes tension, delays, and brewing resentment among Netflix employees, that glittering relationship had burst like a soap bubble. What was supposed to be the start of a new media empire had turned into a cautionary tale. Netflix, once eager to ride the wave of the Sussex brand, had pulled the plug in the most dramatic way possible, with a stern message from Sarandos himself. "You can't do this to my staff." Meghan reportedly left that meeting in tears. And it wasn't just because of the deal. It was the humiliation, the finality, the sudden shift from being courted by the world's biggest streamer to being quietly, but firmly, shut out. This isn't just the story of a failed contract. This is a story of ambition, royalty, corporate power, emotional fallout, and the dangerous illusion of Hollywood promises. This is a story of how two people tried to reinvent themselves on their own terms and collided head-on with the reality of a cutthroat entertainment industry that doesn't care about titles or tiaras. So what exactly happened behind closed doors? What did Meghan and Harry promise that they couldn't deliver? What went so wrong that Netflix, despite all the money, all the hype, and all the press, decided it was no longer worth continuing the partnership? Let's rewind. Back in 2020, the world was in chaos. A global pandemic had shuttered productions, altered how audiences consumed content, and pushed streaming services to the forefront. Amidst all of that, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced they were stepping back as senior royals. Almost instantly, speculation erupted. What would they do next? Where would they go? Were they stepping back or stepping up? Then came the headlines. Netflix signs Harry and Meghan to a multi-year production deal worth an estimated $100 million. It was monumental, unprecedented. A former senior royal couple building a media empire on the world's most powerful streaming platform. Archwell Productions was formed, promising documentaries, docuseries, children's programming, scripted shows, even feature films. At the time, Netflix executives were thrilled. According to insiders, the board believed they had landed the ultimate celebrity power couple. The Sussexes were global figures with an underdog narrative, a royal mystique, and a promise to reshape storytelling for a new era. "This isn't just content," one insider allegedly said. "This is history in the making." But behind the scenes, even in those early months, cracks began to form. The first red flag was Pearl, an animated series Meghan developed about a 12-year-old girl inspired by famous women in history. Announced with much fanfare and personal excitement from Meghan herself, the project quietly slipped into development limbo. By 2022, Netflix had canceled it, citing cost-cutting measures. But according to multiple sources, it wasn't just about money. There were creative disagreements, production delays, and frustrations from Netflix staff who felt they were working with a team that lacked professional production experience. Other projects fared no better. The much-anticipated Heart of Invictus took far longer than expected to complete. Their first major appearance, the 6-episode docuseries Harry and Meghan, did deliver big numbers upon release, but it also brought a wave of criticism. Many questioned its depth, its purpose, and whether it justified the massive investment. And Netflix was taking notes. Internally, executives were growing restless. The Sussexes had promised a new kind of storytelling, bold, inspirational, global. But what they delivered felt, to many at Netflix, like polished PR with limited substance. According to one production manager who spoke off record, they were always chasing the next big idea, but never finishing the first one. That sentiment echoed through multiple departments, from editors to legal teams to marketing. There were reports of Meghan being demanding, changing scripts at the last moment, questioning technical decisions she didn't fully understand. Some staff found her deeply passionate. Others described the experience as exhausting. By early 2023, it became clear that Netflix was no longer seeing the return on investment it had hoped for. Subscribers weren't tuning in for Archewell content beyond the initial buzz. Merchandising and licensing opportunities were minimal, and the volume of new content, compared to other Netflix creators, was sparse. Then came the meetings. One by one, concerns were raised during internal reviews. Staff voiced frustrations. Budgets were being questioned. Teams were exhausted from endless rewrites and directionless pitches. In June of 2025, everything came to a head during a high-level executive meeting. According to someone close to the matter, Netflix's head of original content brought forward a collection of staff complaints, missed deadlines, and negative performance metrics tied to Archewell's content. Sarandos, normally known for being measured and loyal to his creators, reportedly became visibly frustrated. What tipped him over? A staff survey had revealed that multiple members working under Archewell felt bullied, unheard, and emotionally burnt out. Some had quit. Others had requested transfers. One veteran producer reportedly broke down during the meeting, stating, "I didn't sign up for a royal circus." Sarandos stood up, shook his head, and allegedly said the now-famous line, "You can't do this to my staff." It was the moment the tide turned. Instead of discussing a contract renewal for 2026, Netflix shifted the conversation to exit strategies. Archewell Productions would be allowed to complete any content already in post-production, but no new projects would be approved. The contract, still set to expire in September, would not be renewed. The decision, insiders say, was communicated directly to Meghan and Harry over a video call. Meghan, who had been preparing to announce a new documentary series around women entrepreneurs, was reportedly blindsided. She had believed Netflix was simply working through internal politics, not preparing to sever ties entirely. By the time the call ended, Meghan was inconsolable. According to a close associate, she cried for hours, pacing the grounds of their Montecito estate, refusing to take calls from even her closest allies. Harry, meanwhile, was said to be stunned into silence. He thought they had more time, one source claimed. He didn't see this coming. The fallout didn't stop there. Netflix's quiet but clear break from the Sussexes sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Other platforms, once eager to court the couple, grew cautious. Potential sponsors backed off. Talent agents, already wary of Meghan's reputation in Hollywood circles, stopped taking meetings. Even within the royal family, the news made its way across the Atlantic. Palace insiders whispered of King Charles's reaction, reportedly one of restrained amusement. "It was inevitable," he allegedly told a confidant. "You can't build a palace on quicksand." And still, Meghan kept her silence. No public statement. No social media post. No sit-down interview, at least not yet. But behind the scenes, she was unraveling. The weight of public scrutiny. The rejection from Netflix. The internal guilt of dragging Harry into a media war neither of them seemed to be winning. It all came crashing down in that now infamous moment caught by paparazzi. Meghan Markle in the back of a limo, hiding her face from the world, knowing the cameras would never stop rolling. And this is just the beginning. The full story behind this unraveling includes betrayal, burnout, broken promises, and a corporate takedown no one saw coming. It's a tale not just of Hollywood, but of what happens when royalty meets reality, and the cameras aren't so forgiving anymore. Are you ready to hear the whole truth? Because what happened next will leave you stunned. The year was 2020, a time when the world was paralyzed by uncertainty, locked down in homes, clinging to glimmers of hope and entertainment wherever it could be found. And then, in a move that stunned the world, two royals, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, stepped down from their roles as senior members of the British royal family. The decision, now permanently etched into the modern royal saga, came not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap that echoed from Buckingham Palace to Beverly Hills. It was the kind of story that felt too big for tradition, too wild for history books. And yet it was real. For the first time in modern memory, a royal couple had voluntarily walked away from the crown, the pomp, the palaces, and the endless protocol. In doing so, they not only fractured centuries-old expectations, they also stepped into something far more unpredictable, the wild terrain of American celebrity culture. The world's response was a complex cocktail: fascination, fury, sympathy, and skepticism. Headlines painted Meghan as the instigator, Harry as the runaway prince, and the Queen as the matriarch left to clean up the pieces. But far from the shores of the United Kingdom, in the sun-drenched hills of California, a new plan was quietly being formed. Within mere months of their departure from the royal fold, Harry and Meghan had launched Archwell Productions, a production company that, according to early statements, would focus on creating content that informs but also gives hope. But behind the lofty mission statements and poetic PR lines was a business strategy, one aimed squarely at Hollywood's most influential gatekeepers. It didn't take long before the Sussexes found what they were looking for. In September 2020, Netflix announced it had signed a multi-year, exclusive deal with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The reported value? $100 million. To say the announcement shook the entertainment industry would be an understatement. Executives across competing networks scrambled to understand how Netflix had pulled off such a coup. Royal fans erupted in both applause and outrage. The couple, once mocked for wanting privacy, were now planning to become content creators in the very same industry they had once claimed was toxic. The partnership seemed ambitious, even revolutionary. Archwell Productions would tell stories across all formats: documentaries, docuseries, feature films, scripted series, and children's programming. Meghan and Harry would be both behind the camera and in front of it. This was, as one Hollywood columnist put it, the ultimate reinvention story. At first, the mood was jubilant. Netflix insiders claimed the couple were a breath of fresh air. A global power couple with royal credibility, media magnetism, and a unique transatlantic appeal. For Netflix, the decision was as much about prestige as it was about profit. With other streaming platforms like Disney+, HBO Max, and Amazon Prime throwing billions into original content, locking down the Sussexes felt like both a cultural flex and a shrewd investment. And for Meghan and Harry, the Netflix deal symbolized liberation. They were no longer restrained by royal tradition. Now, they could craft their own narrative, shape their public identity, and spotlight the issues they cared about, all while building generational wealth outside of the crown. The first project announced was Pearl, an animated series about a young girl inspired by influential women in history. It was clearly a passion project for Meghan, who released a glowing statement expressing her excitement about partnering with Netflix to bring inspirational content to young audiences. Meanwhile, Harry focused on a documentary series titled Heart of Invictus, aimed at capturing the resilience of wounded veterans, an issue deeply close to his heart given his military background and founding of the Invictus Games. There was real optimism then, a sense that something meaningful could be born from this collaboration, that the Sussexes, free from royal restraint, might become a powerful force for good in the media space. But under the surface, not everything was going as smoothly as the headlines suggested. For starters, there was skepticism within Hollywood. The couple, while immensely famous, had no proven track record as producers or showrunners. Critics whispered behind the scenes, could Meghan and Harry actually deliver? Did they understand the demanding workflows of scripted series or the brutal timelines of content development? Did they even know how to tell stories beyond their own? Even within Netflix, some executives privately raised eyebrows. One former employee later recalled, "It was like everyone was so caught up in the name, in the titles, the crowns, the scandal, that they forgot to ask the basic question, what are they actually making?" Archwell Productions, as it turned out, wasn't a full-fledged studio with a large creative team. It was more of a concept, a brand in search of direction. Many of the initial project ideas reportedly came from Meghan herself. While her passion was undeniable, insiders began to notice a pattern: big ideas, big statements, but very little follow-through. Deadlines were missed. Projects languished in development. Writers and showrunners complained about a lack of clarity. According to one early collaborator, it felt like we were building a plane while flying it, and the passengers had no idea what the destination was. But at the time, none of that made it to the public. In fact, the couple's image was stronger than ever. Their Oprah Winfrey interview, released in 2021, had shaken global consciousness and brought renewed interest in everything they touched. Viewers and fans eagerly awaited their content. Netflix stock soared on the back of subscriber growth fueled by pandemic boredom and royal intrigue. But that momentum was not destined to last. As the pandemic's grip eased and competition in the streaming space tightened, the pressure to deliver real, engaging, high-performing content increased dramatically. Netflix executives began to scrutinize all their production partners, particularly those commanding 8- and 9-figure deals. The question wasn't just, are you producing, but are you producing content that resonates? The Sussexes, by that metric, were beginning to falter. Pearl was shelved before it even entered full production. Heart of Invictus faced multiple delays. And while the couple's docuseries eventually released to strong viewership, many felt it lacked the depth, originality, or creative spark Netflix had hoped for. It was, in the words of one critic, beautifully shot, emotionally edited, but ultimately shallow. Internally, some at Netflix started to question whether they had bought into a brand, not a production powerhouse. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry were increasingly focused on their public image. They launched podcasts, gave interviews, started new initiatives, and began writing books. Meghan's short-lived Spotify podcast, Archetypes, drew controversy for its limited number of episodes and heavily edited content. Spotify would later end their deal with the couple after just one season, another blow to the Sussex brand's credibility in media. Despite these bumps, the couple continued to promote themselves as entrepreneurs, storytellers, and cultural visionaries. They gave speeches at global events, aligned with major humanitarian causes, and appeared at red carpet galas in sleek, curated looks designed to maintain their aura of royalty meets Hollywood. But the numbers didn't lie. Behind the scenes, Netflix analysts were tracking engagement data, and Archwell's projects, while click-worthy in news cycles, were failing to create long-term value or subscriber retention. Other creators with smaller budgets were delivering bigger hits. By late 2024, senior Netflix staff had begun circulating internal reports flagging the Sussex deal as underperforming. Quiet conversations began about the future of the partnership. No official statements were made. No headlines leaked. But the tone had shifted. And for Harry and Meghan, the shift would come with a shocking, personal price. Because the dream that had once been hailed as revolutionary, a royal couple becoming media moguls, was about to collide with a harsh, inescapable truth. In the world of streaming, content is king. And crowns don't guarantee creativity. For a fleeting moment, the Sussexes were riding high. The Netflix deal had not only cemented their new identity as cultural entrepreneurs, but also temporarily quieted critics who had questioned how the couple would sustain themselves financially after walking away from royal duties. But as with many media fairy tales, the high didn't last. Underneath the glittering surface of their new Hollywood life, the machinery that was supposed to deliver groundbreaking content, Archwell Productions, was already beginning to sputter. The first true crack in the glossy narrative came quietly. No major headline, no breaking news alert. Just a subtle update buried within a larger press release from Netflix in May 2022. Pearl, the highly anticipated animated series executive produced by Meghan Markle, had been canceled. At first, the announcement was brushed off as part of a broader cost-cutting initiative at Netflix. The platform had begun pulling back on experimental and high-budget animated series across the board. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone, especially those within the production circles. Behind the scenes, insiders whispered about deeper issues. Pearl hadn't simply been a casualty of a shifting budget. It had been plagued with indecision, creative disagreements, and a development team that couldn't agree on tone or direction. According to one former production coordinator on the project, the team faced weekly script rewrites and mounting frustration. There was no clear vision. Meghan had strong ideas, but she often clashed with creative leads brought in to shape the narrative. Every episode felt like it was being pulled in 3 different directions. This wasn't just a typical case of a slow-moving project in Hollywood. Netflix, known for giving creative freedom to its top-tier partners, was reportedly becoming concerned about the lack of deliverables from the Archwell side. "We gave them money, resources, a platform, but it felt like they didn't know what to do with it," said a person familiar with the INT. Some critics called the series a one-sided rehash of known controversies. Others felt it was overly polished, presenting a sanitized, overly curated version of the Sussexes' journey. "We were expecting a raw, emotionally gripping insight," wrote one critic. "What we got felt more like a brand launch video stretched into 6 hours." More troubling for Netflix was the performance beyond the headlines. While the series brought in a large initial audience, engagement dropped sharply after the first 2 episodes. Viewers weren't sticking around. Social media conversations, while loud, trended negative. There were no awards, no viral moments, no clear proof that this was a franchise worth expanding. It was a bitter pill. Netflix had waited over 2 years for this debut, and it didn't ignite the cultural wildfire they had hoped for. And still, the delays continued. Heart of Invictus, the documentary series centered on the Invictus Games, suffered multiple pushbacks and logistical headaches. The project, meant to showcase the resilience of veterans and injured service members, had the potential to be a powerful, meaningful contribution to the streaming platform's library. But scheduling conflicts, permissions from athletes, and post-production delays turned what should have been a straightforward docuseries into a long, complicated ordeal. To make matters worse, Archwell's internal operations were also under strain. Staff turnover became frequent. Top producers quietly left the team. Lower-level employees, according to some reports, described the environment as chaotic and visionless. The media began to notice. While some outlets remained sympathetic, others began publishing articles asking where the content was. Why, after such a massive deal, had so little been produced? The public began to question whether the Sussexes had overpromised and underdelivered, whether the Netflix deal had been a show of celebrity clout rather than actual creative potential. The whispers started turning into headlines. Are Meghan and Harry worth $100 million? Netflix left waiting as Sussexes missed deadlines. Behind the scenes of Archwell, glamour or ghost town, Meghan's defenders insisted she was being held to an unfair standard, that male celebrities who struggled to deliver were rarely scrutinized so harshly. But even her allies in Hollywood began distancing themselves, or at least hesitating before taking meetings. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry continued to present a calm, united front in public. They gave speeches at mental health conferences, attended charity events, and remained active on social media through their Archwell Foundation. But behind the scenes, the pressure was building. Netflix executives began scheduling internal performance reviews of the deal. According to insiders, data teams provided evidence that the Sussex content was not driving subscriptions in the way other creators, like Shonda Rhimes or Ryan Murphy, had done. Worse, the Sussexes were producing less content than almost any other high-level partner. As one senior Netflix source reportedly said, "This isn't personal. It's business. If the numbers don't make sense, the deal won't either." And the numbers, by all accounts, weren't adding up. The big problem wasn't just that content was delayed. It was that the Sussexes were costing more than they were creating. The resources poured into the Archwell deal, staff hours, development time, PR support, budget flexibility, were being scrutinized under a microscope. Other creators started asking why the Sussexes were being given so much freedom while their own projects were being fast-tracked or axed. Resentment began to bubble. And the couple, perhaps unknowingly, were becoming the source of internal conflict at the very company that had once championed them. By the end of 2024, the buzz around Archwell had all but faded. The media began referring to them as former Netflix stars, even though the contract hadn't officially ended. Pitches from the Sussexes were reportedly being met with lukewarm responses. Meghan tried to repitch Pearl in a revamped format, but the studio heads declined. It was clear the air was leaving the room. Meghan, who had once envisioned herself as the creative force behind a new genre of storytelling, was now watching her projects vanish before they began. And Harry, though emotionally committed to their joint mission, was said to be growing weary of the delays and criticism. The Netflix deal, once their golden ticket, was rapidly becoming an anchor. But the couple wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. Behind the scenes, Meghan had started preparing a final, major pitch to Netflix. A new docuseries, said to be a raw, emotional exploration of motherhood, identity, and womanhood. She believed it would be her comeback moment. She even planned to announce the project in conjunction with her birthday, aiming for a powerful media moment. A statement of resilience, vision, and rebirth. A way to silence critics and remind the industry of her storytelling power. But she never got that chance. Because just days before the announcement, Netflix made a decision that would change everything. The platform would not be renewing its deal with Archwell Productions when the current contract ended. The message was clear: no more extensions, no more pitches, no more projects. And worse, the final blow didn't come through lawyers or agents. It came directly from the top. When Meghan Markle first stepped into the world spotlight as the soon-to-be Duchess of Sussex, her star power seemed undeniable. A biracial American actress marrying into one of the oldest and most exclusive monarchies on Earth. It was a story tailor-made for headlines, fairy tales, and media obsession. From the moment her engagement to Prince Harry was announced, Meghan became a cultural phenomenon. She was bold, outspoken, glamorous, and different. A former Hollywood actress now poised to become a royal icon. And for a while, the world couldn't get enough. But in the world of streaming, where executives speak the cold language of algorithms and engagement charts, that kind of initial celebrity dazzle isn't enough to sustain long-term success. Star power may open doors, but it doesn't finish scripts, meet deadlines, or guarantee that audiences will stay past the first 10 minutes of a pilot episode. And that was the painful reality Meghan Markle began to face as Archwell's content deal with Netflix unraveled. At the outset, Meghan was sold as the face of a new kind of media empire. Insiders at Netflix were told she had big ideas, a deep network of connections, and the ability to attract A-list collaborators. She was supposed to be Netflix's answer to Oprah meets Reese Witherspoon, a woman who could generate content that was commercially successful and socially meaningful. But reality soon revealed a different picture. The first clue came when Netflix realized how little professional infrastructure Meghan had around her. While she had a publicist and a small team of assistants, she lacked a strong, experienced showrunner or executive producer partner with real Hollywood credibility. Archwell Productions, as grand as the name sounded, was more of a shell than a studio. There was no writer's room, no development department, no slate of vetted talent ready to go. It was Meghan and her ideas. And ideas, no matter how passionate or politically correct, don't always translate to viable content. Executives quickly saw a pattern. Meghan was deeply involved in every aspect of development, often to the point of micromanagement. She would sit in on pitch meetings, challenge story structures, and reject casting suggestions. Some insiders admired her hands-on approach. Others found it exhausting. She was, by many accounts, someone who demanded control but struggled to trust the experienced creatives around her. In one early development meeting for a potential docuseries focused on female leadership, Meghan reportedly overruled the showrunner's proposed episode arc, insisting instead on highlighting lesser-known activists from specific regions. The intention was noble. The execution was scattered. Producers were forced to rework the episode, delaying pre-production by months. That same series would later be quietly shelved. Working with her was like working with a client who thinks they're the creative, said one producer, who later exited the deal. She has vision, but she doesn't always know how to translate it into something that works for screen. Another issue was the shifting nature of Meghan's public image. In 2020, fresh off the Oprah interview and the couple's shocking royal exit, she was seen as a symbol of rebellion against outdated institutions. She was riding a wave of public sympathy, especially in America, where she was embraced as a modern woman wronged by the cold grip of monarchy. But that wave began to crash as the months wore on. Media narratives shifted. Piers Morgan and British tabloids led the charge in questioning her motives. Former royal staff began leaking unflattering stories. Even in the United States, whispers about Meghan's difficult behavior started surfacing in entertainment columns. On social media, users began noticing the repeated pattern. Meghan was always the hero, the victim, the misunderstood genius, and everyone else was somehow wrong. This, in turn, impacted Netflix's perception of her marketability. According to internal audience research seen by Netflix's marketing team, Meghan's name began to polarize audiences more than it attracted them. Older viewers were more skeptical. International viewers, especially in the UK and Australia, were largely negative. Even among younger American audiences, the demographic Netflix most covets, the reaction was split. One survey showed that only 42% of respondents viewed Meghan as relatable, while 68% described her as overexposed. And in the unforgiving world of streaming, overexposure is a death sentence. Netflix thrives on two things: fresh talent and repeat engagement. And while Meghan was certainly famous, she wasn't translating into the kind of repeat viewership the platform needed. Her docuseries didn't spawn a wave of similar content. Her podcast had already underperformed on Spotify, and worst of all, she hadn't yet produced a single scripted series. Despite it being a major component of her original pitch, executives began asking uncomfortable questions. Why weren't scripts moving forward? Why had multiple top-tier producers declined to work with Archwell? Why were meetings with Meghan always high drama, yet low output? Part of the problem was Meghan's insistence on perfection. According to multiple staffers who worked with Archwell, she frequently rejected drafts because they didn't match her voice. Some episodes were reworked so many times that deadlines were missed entirely. At one point, an entire development team for a children's show was disbanded after Meghan changed her mind about the show's tone, from lighthearted and whimsical to serious and educational. Netflix, which had originally given the couple creative freedom, began to regret the lack of oversight. By early 2024, the company had assigned a dedicated executive liaison to all Archwell-related projects. Their job was to keep projects on track, manage communication, and act as a buffer between Meghan's team and the broader Netflix content apparatus. But even that didn't help much. The issues weren't logistical, they were foundational. It became clear that Meghan was trying to build a media empire around herself without the traditional foundation: a team of seasoned producers, flexible creatives, and the humility to delegate. In meetings, she often insisted that her experience as a former actress made her qualified to run entire productions. But the reality, as noted by several Netflix staffers, was that acting in front of a camera is a different world from running what happens behind it. Adding to the tension was the sense that Meghan's projects lacked universality. Many of her pitches were themed around issues that mattered to her personally: racism, feminism, identity politics. Noble themes, yes. But according to Netflix's data team, such projects weren't performing well globally. They were niche. Not wrong or bad, but specific. And specificity doesn't always justify a $100 million deal. Compare that with other Netflix titans. Shonda Rhimes created Bridgerton, a cultural phenomenon that blended romance, historical fantasy, and diversity into a binge-worthy package. Ryan Murphy, known for his unique voice, had churned out hit after hit for Netflix, spanning genres from horror to musical drama. Meghan, by contrast, had not yet delivered even one fully original concept that made it to release, let alone trended worldwide. Still, she believed in her vision. By mid-2024, she was working on a new docuseries intended to spotlight women balancing motherhood and careers, featuring real interviews and personal anecdotes. The idea was simple and touching, but it lacked clear structure. Netflix reviewers called the pilot well-intentioned but directionless. It was never greenlit. Perhaps the most difficult pill to swallow for Meghan was that her royal status didn't carry as much weight in the boardrooms of Hollywood as it did in the palaces of Britain. The streaming industry is driven by metrics, not monarchy. And while her fame had opened doors, her creative misfires were now closing them. Even attempts to involve Harry more directly had failed to reignite interest. Netflix had initially been enthusiastic about his Heart of Invictus series. But Harry, too, struggled to balance authenticity with production needs. He hated retakes. He despised staged interviews. He wanted everything to feel raw and real, but that wasn't always feasible on tight production timelines. The final product, while moving, was delayed and barely promoted. At a certain point, executives began having the conversation no one wanted to have. Had they overestimated the Sussexes? Had they let the glamour of a royal scandal blind them to the practical needs of content creation? Was Meghan Markle's star already dimming? And worse, Was she even capable of pivoting? Meghan, despite the mounting pressure, refused to acknowledge the cracks. She pressed on, pitching new projects, refining old ones, and speaking passionately in meetings about the importance of representation and voice. But the fatigue on both sides was palpable. Ted Sarandos, who had once called the couple's potential limitless, was now hearing daily complaints from his internal teams. They weren't just tired of the drama, they were losing faith. And in Hollywood, once that happens, it's only a matter of time. Prince Harry had always been a man caught between two worlds, the institution and the individual, the crown and the conscience. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer intensity of the divide he would face after stepping away from royal duties and signing on to a world dominated not by protocol, but by profit. When the Netflix deal was first inked, Harry was portrayed by his team as deeply committed to producing inspiring, meaningful content. He wasn't just riding Meghan's Hollywood wave. He had passion, he had experience, and, most importantly, he had stories to tell. Stories about veterans, mental health, childhood trauma, and the hidden corners of royalty that had shaped and scarred him. But the deeper Harry dove into this new world of commercial entertainment, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a natural fit. His idea of authenticity clashed with Hollywood's obsession with polish. His desire for real, raw storytelling clashed with streaming platforms that wanted curated, binge-worthy packages wrapped in drama. At first, Harry tried to adapt. He hired media consultants, sat through production meetings, and took feedback. He listened to executive notes about how to build narrative arcs, how to pace interviews, how to enhance engagement by adding dramatic music or lighting effects. But slowly, something began to gnaw at him, an uncomfortable sense that his personal truths were being commodified, sliced apart, and sold to an audience that wasn't listening to understand, but rather to consume. His first major project, Heart of Invictus, was supposed to be his moment of clarity. A documentary series following wounded soldiers competing in the Invictus Games, a cause Harry had championed for years and one that gave him purpose beyond the monarchy. He poured his heart into it. He gave interviews, spent time on location, connected with the veterans, and tried to ensure their stories were told with dignity. But Netflix had other ideas. The footage they wanted emphasized drama, breakdowns, emotional collapses, competitive tension. They wanted the grit, the darkness, the tears. Harry was horrified. "These are soldiers, not spectacle," he reportedly told one producer. "Their pain isn't content." The tension grew. At one point, Harry allegedly threatened to walk off the project if certain scenes weren't removed. Netflix caved, but not happily. Behind the scenes, executives complained that Harry was too precious and didn't understand the entertainment business. And yet, Harry couldn't bring himself to play along. He had spent most of his life being packaged and sold by an institution he no longer trusted, the monarchy. Now, he was beginning to feel that the new world he had joined was just another version of the same thing. Different players, same game. Worse still, he was aware of how he was being portrayed. In the media, he was increasingly seen as Meghan's sidekick, the prince who gave up everything for love, only to become a secondary character in his wife's Hollywood ambitions. It stung. Harry loved Meghan fiercely. But he was beginning to realize that the world saw him less as an equal partner and more as a man who had traded a throne for a Netflix pitch deck. Privately, friends said he was torn. On one hand, he believed in the freedom he and Meghan had fought for. On the other, he missed the clarity of royal duty. He missed being a soldier, a patron, a public servant. He missed his family, or at least the version of it that once felt whole. The royal legacy he'd tried to escape was now haunting him from across the ocean. British tabloids ran relentless stories painting him as weak, manipulated, unmoored. The palace issued no statements. Charles kept his distance. William grew increasingly cold. Meghan encouraged Harry to stay focused, to see this as just another chapter in their journey. She reminded him that building something new takes time, that the old world would never understand them, that they were creating something bigger than any title could offer. But Harry's faith was beginning to crack. He would come home late from meetings, drained. He stopped reading emails from Netflix producers. He ghosted internal calls. One staffer noted, he just didn't seem like he wanted to be part of it anymore. And then came the moment that shook him. Meghan, despite the mounting pressure, refused to acknowledge the cracks. She pressed on, pitching new projects, refining old ones, and speaking passionately in meetings about the importance of representation and voice. But the fatigue on both sides was palpable. Ted Sarandos, who had once called the couple's potential limitless, was now hearing daily complaints from his internal teams. They weren't just tired of the drama, they were losing faith. And in Hollywood, once that happens, it's only a matter of time. Prince Harry had always been a man caught between two worlds, the institution and the individual, the crown and the conscience. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer intensity of the divide he would face after stepping away from royal duties and signing on to a world dominated not by protocol, but by profit. When the Netflix deal was first inked, Harry was portrayed by his team as deeply committed to producing inspiring, meaningful content. He wasn't just riding Meghan's Hollywood wave. He had passion, he had experience, and, most importantly, he had stories to tell. Stories about veterans, mental health, childhood trauma, and the hidden corners of royalty that had shaped and scarred him. But the deeper Harry dove into this new world of commercial entertainment, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a natural fit. His idea of authenticity clashed with Hollywood's obsession with polish. His desire for real, raw storytelling clashed with streaming platforms that wanted curated, binge-worthy packages wrapped in drama. At first, Harry tried to adapt. He hired media consultants, sat through production meetings, and took feedback. He listened to executive notes about how to build narrative arcs, how to pace interviews, how to enhance engagement by adding dramatic music or lighting effects. But slowly, something began to gnaw at him. An uncomfortable sense that his personal truths were being commodified, sliced apart, and sold to an audience that wasn't listening to understand, but rather to consume. His first major project, Heart of Invictus, was supposed to be his moment of clarity. A documentary series following wounded soldiers competing in the Invictus Games, a cause Harry had championed for years and one that gave him purpose beyond the monarchy. He poured his heart into it. He gave interviews, spent time on location, connected with the veterans, and tried to ensure their stories were told with dignity. But Netflix had other ideas. The footage they wanted emphasized drama, breakdowns, emotional collapses, competitive tension. They wanted the grit, the darkness, the tears. Harry was horrified. These are soldiers, not spectacle, he reportedly told one producer. Their pain isn't content. The tension grew. At one point, Harry allegedly threatened to walk off the project if certain scenes weren't removed. Netflix caved, but not happily. Behind the scenes, executives complained that Harry was too precious and didn't understand the entertainment business. And yet, Harry couldn't bring himself to play along. He had spent most of his life being packaged and sold by an institution he no longer trusted, the monarchy. Now, he was beginning to feel that the new world he had joined was just another version of the same thing. Different players, same game. Worse still, he was aware of how he was being portrayed. In the media, he was increasingly seen as Meghan's sidekick, the prince who gave up everything for love, only to become a secondary character in his wife's Hollywood ambitions. It stung. Harry loved Meghan fiercely, but he was beginning to realize that the world saw him less as an equal partner and more as a man who had traded a throne for a Netflix pitch deck. Privately, friends said he was torn. On one hand, he believed in the freedom he and Meghan had fought for. On the other, he missed the clarity of royal duty. He missed being a soldier, a patron, a public servant. He missed his family, or at least the version of it that once felt whole. The royal legacy he'd tried to escape was now haunting him from across the ocean. British tabloids ran relentless stories painting him as weak, manipulated, unmoored. The palace issued no statements. Charles kept his distance. William grew increasingly cold. Meghan encouraged Harry to stay focused, to see this as just another chapter in their journey. She reminded him that building something new takes time, that the old world would never understand them, that they were creating something bigger than any title could offer. But Harry's faith was beginning to crack. He would come home late from meetings, drained. He stopped reading emails from Netflix producers. He ghosted internal calls. One staffer noted, he just didn't seem like he wanted to be part of it anymore. And then came the moment that shook him. It was during a screening of the first cut of Heart of Invictus. Harry sat in a private viewing room with Meghan, two Netflix executives, and the post-production team. As the footage rolled, Harry watched himself on screen, giving heartfelt speeches, hugging competitors, choking up during interviews. But then came a scene he hadn't seen before, a veteran breaking down in tears, a camera zooming in, dramatic music swelling, and the Netflix logo fading in. It felt cheap, exploitative, manipulative. Harry stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked out of the room and didn't return. That night, he reportedly told Meghan, "I don't recognize myself in any of this." It was a confession that echoed deeper than just a single documentary. It reflected his growing discomfort with the entire Netflix endeavor. The machine they had joined, the one meant to amplify their voices, was now molding those voices into something they never intended. To complicate matters, Harry's own family was leveraging this moment to fuel their narrative. Royal insiders leaked that Harry was losing himself, that he was being used, that he had sacrificed everything for the illusion of freedom. William, it was said, had stopped returning his calls altogether. Charles was cordial, but distant. The firm had moved on, and that silence hurt. Harry, for all his attempts to detach, was still a Windsor. He still carried the weight of his mother's memory, his father's legacy, and the expectations that had been placed upon him since the day he was born. The Netflix deal, which had once felt like emancipation, now felt like a trap. He began to pull back. At meetings, he was quieter. He deferred to Meghan. He spent more time with their children, less time in the production office. When asked about new project ideas, he reportedly shrugged. "I just want to do something that matters," he told one assistant. "Not something that trends." The emotional toll was visible. Friends described Harry as tired, wary, and burned out. The pressure of keeping the brand alive, of living up to a $100 million deal, of navigating a marriage, a family, a public image, and unresolved trauma, it was suffocating. And yet, he couldn't stop. The contract was still active. The commitments were still there. The expectations hadn't gone away. But something inside Harry had shifted. He began to ask questions about their exit strategy. What would happen if Netflix pulled out? Could they survive it? What would the media say? Would people think they had failed? Would it confirm every insult that had ever been hurled at Meghan? At him? These weren't just business questions. They were deeply personal. Because, for Harry, every public move was also a statement about his values, his journey, his identity. And the idea that their grand experiment in freedom might be crumbling was too painful to face directly. So he avoided it. He focused on his children, on his foundation work, on the Invictus Games, anything that reminded him of his core purpose. But the tension with Netflix wasn't going away. And as Meghan pushed harder to revive projects and pitch new series, Harry found himself drifting further away from the business, from the team, even from her at times. They argued, not about love, but about direction, purpose, identity. Harry wanted to be meaningful. Meghan wanted to be successful. And somewhere between those two goals, the walls of Archewell were beginning to shake. When Netflix finally made its decision to not renew the deal, Harry wasn't surprised. He had felt it coming for months. He had sensed the coldness in executive emails, the lack of enthusiasm in recent meetings, the guarded tones in video calls. What caught him off guard was the timing and the finality. They had hoped to pitch one more project. They had hoped for a second chance. But there would be no pitch, no extension, no room for negotiation. The door had closed. And as Harry watched Meghan process the rejection, as he saw the tears in her eyes, the disbelief on her face, the devastation in her voice, he felt the full weight of his choice crashing down on him. He had given up everything for this new life. But was this really freedom? Or was it just another gilded cage? For months, Archewell Productions had projected an image of creative energy and progressive ambition. Outwardly, the company seemed to be everything Hollywood claimed to love, diverse, values-driven, and tied to two of the most recognizable names on the planet. But behind the pristine branding and PR-crafted mission statements, a far different story was unfolding, one that began trickling out quietly through resignations, whispered phone calls, and, eventually, formal complaints. It began as murmurs. A grip walking off set, a scheduling manager requesting a department transfer, a freelance editor refusing to return for post-production revisions. But those murmurs grew into patterns, and soon enough, the patterns became undeniable. People weren't just leaving Archewell, they were fleeing it. The earliest red flags appeared during the pre-production phase of Meghan's now-defunct animated project, Pearl. According to a former assistant story editor, the work environment quickly descended into a whirlwind of indecision, last-minute changes, and what she described as a culture of fear. Tasks were delegated without clarity. Feedback was inconsistent. Entire story arcs were approved one week and scrapped the next. One junior animator, who asked to remain anonymous due to a non-disclosure agreement, recalled working 12 to 14-hour days redoing sequences that Meghan personally found off-tone. "It was like walking on eggshells," he said. "You never knew what would trigger a total project pivot." Many of these early frustrations were chalked up to growing pains. Archwell was a new company, after all, and growing fast. But by the time production began on Heart of Invictus, the staff's complaints had become more pointed. Multiple sources described a breakdown in communication that bordered on negligence. Schedules were constantly revised without warning. Creative direction came late or contradicted previous guidance. And then there were the meetings, long, frequent, and, according to several staff members, utterly chaotic. "It wasn't unusual to have 3 meetings a day for a single decision," said one producer who left the company 6 months before the Netflix deal fell apart. And those meetings often just ended with more questions than answers. At the center of much of this chaos was Meghan herself. Passionate, involved, and deeply protective of her projects, she insisted on overseeing even the smallest details. But that involvement often tipped into over-control. Former staffers described her as demanding to a fault, and more of a perfectionist than even the most seasoned Hollywood execs. While it's not uncommon for high-level creatives to be hands-on, the issue at Archwell was the lack of structure beneath Meghan's leadership. There were no seasoned showrunners with enough authority to push back. Producers and assistants often bore the brunt of the stress, taking the blame when things went wrong, yet having little power to prevent it. One former production coordinator claimed that staff morale was so low by early 2024 that 2 employees resigned within a week of each other, citing mental health reasons in their exit interviews. Netflix, at first, tried to ignore the noise. But as complaints began filtering back through department channels, their human resources and oversight teams quietly started gathering data. Internally, a confidential staff feedback survey was circulated among production contractors and collaborators tied to Archwell projects. The results, as reported by someone familiar with the findings, were alarming. Among the key concerns listed: lack of creative clarity, leadership vacuum, unrealistic expectations without adequate support, emotional volatility in feedback sessions, no consistent workflow or production pipeline, and, most damning of all, several respondents referred to the environment as toxic. This wasn't just a few disgruntled staffers venting. It was a clear pattern, one that suggested deep-rooted dysfunction within Archwell's core operations. Netflix executives were stunned. This was supposed to be their marquee partnership, their crown jewel of prestige and progress. Instead, it was quickly becoming a liability. Further complicating matters were the freelancers and third-party contractors brought in to support the Archwell projects. Many were high-level creatives with resumes that included major studios, hit shows, and award-winning films. But even they found the environment untenable. "It's not that Meghan was cruel," said one producer who worked on early development for a scripted series that never saw the light of day. "It's that there was no system, no consistency. One day you'd be told a concept was brilliant. The next day you'd be asked why it hadn't been thrown out yet." The whiplash was exhausting. That constant pivoting, coupled with Meghan's tendency to revise materials up until the last minute, created what several insiders called the Meghan bottleneck. Nothing moved forward without her explicit approval. But her schedule, packed with public appearances, charity engagements, and family obligations, made it nearly impossible to secure consistent feedback. So projects stalled, deadlines passed, budgets ballooned, and the staff burned out. Some attempted to raise concerns directly. Others voiced their frustrations in indirect ways, missing meetings, calling in sick, declining renewal contracts. But for a while, the Archwell leadership team, including Harry and Meghan, appeared either unaware or unwilling to confront the internal collapse. And then, the stories began to leak. In early 2025, A former assistant anonymously shared her experience with an industry podcast under a pseudonym. She didn't name Meghan directly, but the references were clear. I worked for a production house run by someone very, very famous. It was like being in a constant state of panic. Nothing was ever good enough. And the emotional toll? Let's just say I needed therapy after I left. The episode went viral within industry circles. Executives at other studios began hearing the same anecdotes. Netflix, alarmed by the growing chatter, commissioned an internal audit of their premium talent partnerships, including Archewell. At this point, the complaints could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Netflix legal stepped in. Their HR teams interviewed former staff. A private memo circulated among Netflix's executive board outlining the severity of the problem. It stated, according to sources familiar with the document, that the working conditions around Archewell Productions had reached a level of dysfunction that would be considered unacceptable in any mature creative ecosystem. When Ted Sarandos was briefed on the findings, he reportedly slammed the file shut and said, "We are not babysitters. This is a business." The warning signs were flashing in neon. And for Netflix, the cost of continuing the Archewell partnership was no longer just monetary. It was reputational. Even more troubling was the emerging pattern of top-tier creatives rejecting Archewell's calls. Agents from 3 major Hollywood talent agencies confirmed that their clients were now passing on meetings with Meghan's team. "It's not worth the chaos," one agent reportedly told a client. "No show is worth the stress." And still, inside the walls of Archewell, Meghan tried to push forward. She circulated a memo about a renewed commitment to excellence. She offered feedback sessions to department heads. She even reached out personally to several former staff members, inviting them to return. None of them accepted. The damage was done. The culture was broken. Harry, for his part, remained mostly removed from day-to-day operations. Sources say he was aware but exhausted, choosing instead to focus on his philanthropic work and family. Some former employees believed he didn't fully grasp how bad the work environment had become. Others suspected he was simply in too deep to intervene. The internal chaos at Archewell began leaking into public performance. Meghan's much-teased women's empowerment docuseries, once poised to be her big comeback, was pushed back repeatedly. Staff turnover delayed post-production. Interviewees pulled out. The final cut was described by Netflix reviewers as flat, disjointed, and lacking a clear emotional hook. Netflix had enough. When Sarandos delivered his now-famous line, "You can't do this to my staff," it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment outburst. It was the result of months of pressure, broken trust, and mounting concern from every level of the company. He wasn't just protecting his employees, he was preserving Netflix's integrity. Meghan, upon hearing the decision, reportedly broke down in disbelief. She had poured herself into these projects. She believed in their mission. She saw herself as a visionary, a builder, a disruptor. But to many of the people working behind the scenes, she was something else entirely. A symbol of good intentions gone awry, of leadership without grounding, and of ambition that ignored the toll it took on others. The toxic production environment wasn't just a footnote in Archewell's story. It was the heart of its unraveling, and it would only get worse. In the sterile boardrooms of Netflix's Los Angeles headquarters, where walls of glass give way to towering whiteboards and digital dashboards flicker with viewership metrics, a decision was forming. One that would ripple through the upper echelons of the entertainment industry and bring a sudden, dramatic halt to a partnership that had once been heralded as historic. The breaking point had arrived. Ted Sarandos, Netflix's co-CEO and one of the most influential figures in global media, had long been a supporter of innovation. He prided himself on taking creative risks, backing unique voices, and betting on disruptive talent. When the Sussexes signed with Netflix in 2020, Sarandos was among their loudest champions. He believed in their story, their potential, and the power of attaching the Netflix name to global royalty. But by mid-2025, he was done. The months leading up to the decision had been a storm of miscommunications, unmet deadlines, internal staff complaints, and embarrassing production misfires. Every week, new memos landed on Sarandos's desk, recaps of production delays, notes from human resources about contractor grievances, warnings from legal teams about exposure to reputational damage. He opened by expressing appreciation for their work, praising the effort behind their two released projects. Then he laid down the truth. Netflix had reviewed its premium content partnerships, and after careful consideration, would not be renewing the Archwell deal. According to sources close to the situation, Meghan's face fell almost instantly. The smile vanished. Her eyes welled up. She asked, "But why now?" "We were just finalizing our next pitch." Sarandos was measured, but firm. "We've reached a point where we have to prioritize our internal teams. The feedback from those working on Archwell projects has been consistent. We can't ignore it anymore." Meghan pushed back. She said she was aware of some complaints, but that the narratives were being twisted by people who didn't understand her vision. She insisted that Archwell had something powerful to offer, that they were just getting started. Harry remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the screen, letting the conversation unfold around him. Then Sarandos delivered the final blow, the one line that would reportedly leave Meghan in tears. "This isn't personal," he said, "but you can't do this to my staff." The meeting ended with formalities. Meghan nodded politely, though her expression had hardened. Harry thanked Sarandos and logged off first. Meghan stayed for a few seconds longer. According to the executive note-taker, she whispered, "You have no idea what this is going to do to us." Then the screen went black. Back at the Montecito estate, Meghan was inconsolable. Sources say she retreated to her bedroom and didn't come out for hours. Staff were instructed to cancel her upcoming commitments. A birthday appearance tied to her new docuseries was quietly pulled from the schedule. For Harry, the emotional toll was different. It wasn't explosive, it was internal. He went for a walk, declined interviews, and avoided calls from friends. According to someone close to the family, he was processing it like a soldier, silently, but deeply. Sarandos, for his part, said nothing publicly. Internally, he held a private town hall for Netflix staff, reiterating his commitment to employee well-being and creative integrity. Without naming names, he emphasized the importance of partnerships that respect not just the platform, but the people behind it. His message was clear: Netflix would no longer allow celebrity status to override its standards. And for Meghan and Harry, the implications were staggering. This wasn't just the loss of a deal. It was the collapse of the pillar that had supported their post-royal rebrand. Netflix had been their foundation. Without it, the Archwell empire was suddenly unanchored. Worse still, the industry was watching. Other studios, Amazon, Apple, HBO, were already aware of the Archwell difficulties. Sarandos's decision, though not yet public, had triggered a quiet ripple effect. Calls went unreturned. Pitch meetings were postponed. Talent agencies stopped recommending collaborations. The fallout had begun, and at the heart of it was one devastating truth: star power can light the way, but it can't build the road. And when the road falls apart, it's not the paparazzi who show up. It's the people behind the scenes, the crew, the staff, the editors, who remember how they were treated and who speak louder than any royal decree. The silence in the aftermath of Netflix's decision was deafening. In the days following Ted Sarandos's virtual meeting with Meghan and Harry, Archwell's Montecito estate became a fortress of whispers. Staff moved in hushed tones. The once busy production offices stood still, and behind the thick walls of their palatial home, the Sussexes faced a reckoning neither had anticipated coming so soon, nor so bluntly. The $100 million deal, once the cornerstone of their public narrative, had not just expired. It had collapsed, undone by delays, internal drama, and unmet expectations. But the worst part wasn't that the deal was ending. It was that the end came with humiliation. Netflix didn't just pass on a renewal. They had made it known, in no uncertain terms, that they didn't want more. That silence spoke louder than a press release. Still, Meghan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Even after Sarandos's final words, she attempted to keep the vision alive. In her eyes, this wasn't the end. It was a pivot point. She believed that Netflix had mishandled the creative process, misunderstood the messaging, and failed to market her projects with the strategy they deserved. She instructed her inner team to assemble a new pitch package: polished decks, teaser scripts, fresh concept art, in hopes that a quick turnaround could spark renewed interest before the expiration date hit. But it was already too late. The studio's internal gatekeepers had moved on. No more meetings were being scheduled. No memos were circulating. Emails to content heads were met with polite, canned responses. "Thank you for the update. We'll pass it along," followed by digital silence. Even worse, news of the deal's pending expiration had begun to leak. A well-known entertainment insider tweeted, cryptically, "Hearing whispers about a high-profile, streaming breakup. Once worth $100 million. Now, not even worth a pitch meeting." The entertainment gossip machine kicked into high gear, and within days, entertainment blogs began speculating that Netflix and the Sussexes had quietly parted ways. Within Archwell's circle, the pressure spiked. What few remaining employees still clung to the company began updating their resumes. A junior assistant was overheard asking a friend if Disney was hiring. Editors who had been waiting for green lights on new footage started packing their drives. Consultants and freelancers who had once chased Archwell contracts now backed out gracefully, citing other obligations. And then came the worst of it, the camera crews. When Meghan and Harry launched Archwell Productions, they retained exclusive behind-the-scenes footage from every internal meeting, brainstorming session, and creative retreat.